super exciting one to end on. I have Dan Ryan. I have come across Dan Ryan over the last couple of years. He is a retailer. I came across him through a book club, I do remember, that we set up at one point. And Dan is very much all about retail. He's so much experience. And when you talk to Dan, you just go away off a phone call or off a Zoom and you just have more of that knowledge. And I love listening to the stories he has. He's a retailer at heart. He's a startup investor, and he's invested in really cool emerging companies, which he's going to tell you about in this episode. He's a mentor and he gives talks and speeches all around the world. So welcome, Dan. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Louise.
Tell us a little bit about Dan Ryan, okay? So for anyone,
it was very hard to follow all of that now, but I hope I can do it justice. I classed myself as a retailer. I saw an ad for Penneys many years ago for a trainee manager when I was in Cork, and ended up starting my retail career with Penneys in Dublin in Mary Street. And I always say I had kind of 3 careers with them. I was in store operations, then I got into the buying office, which I'll come back to. And then in the latter part of my first stint with Penneys, I was in merchandise control. So I ended up managing the buyers with their open to buy, a bit like pocket money for the buyers and all that. But I suppose in my store operations experience and my buying experience, they felt that Penneys team felt that I could add value to that role. Then I got headhunted to go to Brown Thomas. They were actually looking for a store manager in Cork at the time. And when they saw my CV, they were also implementing a new system in for their buying office. So I went in there as a merchandise control. I often say that I went from the sublime to ridiculous as regards prices, because we were selling shirts for £5.99 in Penneys, and then we were looking at shirts for £99 in Brown Thomas, and dealing with all the brands and all that stuff. So it was a great experience for me to go from private label, high volume, to understanding department store business and brands and the power of brands. So that was a fantastic experience. And then, funny enough, I never fell out with the Penneys guys, and I think this is a piece that I would always say about mine, and I do talks about the importance of loyalty and not burning bridges. So when I resigned from Penneys, it was a very tough decision to make after all that time. I kind of grew up with them in retail. I resigned to Bridget Donoghue. So anybody who knows Mr. Donoghue will know how intimidating it is to even resign to Bridget. And then I was asked to go in the following day, got a phone call at home to meet Mr. Ryan on Saturday morning, Arthur Ryan, God rest him, to see if he could change my mind. And it was very tough chat with him, but it ended very nicely, because he said, okay, Dan, you're like an old girlfriend, we split up, but we'll stay in touch. So would you mind meeting me the first Friday of every month for a drink? It was like, well, of course, I wouldn't mind meeting Mr. Ryan once a month. The first Friday of every month we used to meet in the Berkeley Court, which is gone now. And he tried to get me back to Penneys a couple of times, but the third time he got me back. So I went back to Penneys to help with the European expansion, which was great. Understand how the Primark brand is better known. Went into Spain initially and then Portugal. And whilst I was with them, I had an approach to join the board of Lifestyle Sports. I'd met Mark Stafford, the CEO, in a previous piece of work I did with Brown Thomas for him, helped him on something. So he asked me to join the board. I love sport, I love retail. So I joined the board of Lifestyle Sports for 4 years. Very exciting time initially, but then the Lehman Brothers banking crash happened, and business was just went up to scale. It was so tough. Sales were down 20 to 30% on the previous year, that year. And I became known as Dan, the cancellation man. You did forward bookings with the likes of Nike and Adidas and all those kind of brands. You did forward bookings. So in other words, where we now we're in July, you'd be buying for the second quarter of next year. So it was called futures. And business was so poor that we had to cancel a lot of stock and not take in our commitments. And that was very difficult. But we weren't the only retailer doing that. And then I got headhunted to join a business in the UK called Shop Direct Group, better known in Ireland as Littlewoods. They were migrating from a catalogue business into understanding online shopping. The beauty for me at the time was that I knew bricks retailing, but I didn't know clicks. Littlewoods had sold all their stores, so it was just pure online with a catalogue business that they were migrating away from, which was a big challenge for them. This is in 2012, so about 11 years ago. And people were using phones and iPads a bit more for shopping. So I learned an awful lot about how you have photographs up on your website and returns and getting stuff sent back to you and all that kind of stuff, and how you manage returns. Unfortunately, and I should have seen it coming, because I was asked to reduce my workforce by 20%. So I had to let a lot of my people go because they were migrating, as I said, from the catalog business to online, and there was a lot of people in head office at the time. And I should have seen it coming. I didn't last there very long, only because the CEO and the product director left the business after a few months. And once I had restructured my team, the level I was at, which is the buying director, that level was also restructured. So 3 of us were combined into one. So myself and another guy called Damien, who's out down in Australia doing very well for himself. We lost our jobs. I remember being in Liverpool airport in my early 50s, going home without a job. And I'd say this when I do talks in colleges and that about not burning bridges. I had 2 great referees. I had Arthur Ryan from Primark, and I had Paul Kelly from Brown Thomas. And I reached out to them and said, look, Liverpool didn't work out. And I met them when I came back to Ireland, and Paul offered me a role to work with a business in the Netherlands called the Buying Corp, which is Dutch for BI. Selfridges had bought that business. So I worked in the Netherlands for a few years with the Buying Corp. And then while I was away, Mr. Weston bought Arnott's. So I helped with the integration of Arnott's and Brown Thomas. And then a few years ago, coming to another stage of my life where I said, you know what, I'm going to step away from corporate retail. I'm going to do a bit of stuff myself. Because when I was in the Netherlands, I had to spend so many nights in Ireland to be domiciled in Ireland because I was being paid by the Selfridges group. They also, by the way, assigned me to another job in Canada for a while, which I'll come back to. But I was mentoring people, and the girls, for instance, the Beauty Buddy had reached out to me through LinkedIn. And I thought I might do a bit more of that kind of stuff. So I stepped away from the corporate world a few years ago, kind of fell into being an investor in the startups just by chance. I didn't realize I was an angel investor until I put some money into the Beauty Buddy app, and I pitched for investment. So
that's really interesting. So that happened. So you got reached out to by someone on LinkedIn that wanted to mentor. And
well, Wendy tells a good story about that. She says when she saw her surname Ryan and saw I worked for Selfridges, it was a good chance I was Irish and would be interested in chatting to them, 2 Irish girls.
Wow. Yeah. Okay, interesting. Yeah. Amazing. And then so they reached out to you to get this mentoring support, and then you decided to do that, and you really enjoyed that kind of work.
Yeah, and I introduced them. I remember having coffee with Wendy, and I'm a big believer. I used to have another nickname called Dan the Action Man. So I rang a few people while I was chatting to Wendy. So
wait, again, Dan the
Action Man.
Oh, brilliant. It's a tagline. I want that in the LinkedIn hashtag.
Yeah. Anyway, I have a good loud laugh too, which will come.
Yeah, I'm just getting an image of you in those Action Man boxes, and you just standing.
Yeah. Sorry, exactly. Yeah. So I made some phone calls on the spot. So I rang some people I knew in the beauty industry who had moved on to other businesses, and arranged, said, look, will you please meet with Wendy, because the app is best described as TripAdvisor for beauty. Yeah. And then Wendy kept meeting me, and I got to understand a bit more about what she was doing in the startup world and raising investment. And I offered them a small amount of money to keep the business going at the beginning and put an investment in. And then when we were doing a bigger funding raise, I did what was called a follow-on investment, and which I've learned an awful lot about the startup world in Ireland as a result. And then when I pitched for an investment to, for instance, it's called HBAN in Ireland, HBA, and the Halo Business Angel Network in the west of Ireland. By having put some of my own money into the business, it helped get people in that room to be interested, and we ended up landing an investor on that particular pitch. So we also got what's called matched funding from Enterprise Ireland. And so if you raise a certain amount of money privately, you also get a government support. It's called matched funding. And Beauty Buddy ended up being what's called a HPSU, a high potential startup. So Enterprise Ireland are very good at supporting startups, particularly if they've raised money. Because as I said to you, I didn't realize I was an angel investor, but apparently because I put a big chunk of my own money in, you're specified as an angel investor as a result. So that brings you to where I am now. So I'm involved with 3 companies now: the Beauty Buddy, PG Lean, which is an athleisure brand started by Sharon Keegan, and then I'm involved with a sustainable clothing brand called Kokoro Zenwear, started by Sharon Barron, and then I do a bit of mentoring and consultancy work under a brand that my niece put a logo together for Amy called DR Retail. I don't have a website or a company name or anything, but I get a lot of work through word of mouth or through LinkedIn again, where people have found me, looked at my background. And the 2 things that I always say I can bring to the table for those startups and new brands and helping them is my network, because I have a big network in retail, and also my experience. That's why I have less hair and grey tinted highlights of my own. That's me in a nutshell.
Yeah, really interested. Dan, talk us through, I suppose, you know, you've had such an array of positions, because, you know, most people that are in retail, they go into buying, as you know, or they go into branch merchandising, or they stay in operations. You seem to have gone into, which is quite unusual, because I've been in retail. You've gone into literally all of those, nearly those different, you know.
I suppose in a way, Louise, I was lucky. You could make your own luck too. So when I was a trainee with Penneys.
But did you enjoy it all, I suppose, Dan?
Yeah. No, it was fantastic.
Wow, okay.
It was fantastic. But I managed, when they take in a cohort of trainees, they send you to different stores and they take you away from your home environment. So I do remember the store manager in Cork interviewed me, Brendan Murphy, telling me that you wouldn't get your menus cooking anymore, and you won't get a Saturday off unless you're getting married when you go into retail. But I was assigned to the head office store in Maerley Street, where all the head office is overhead, all the senior team were there. So I was kind of in the eye line of the senior team. They'd see me in the shop. I was transferred to Dún Laoghaire. I always worked between Maerley Street and Dún Laoghaire. And when the buying office was being reshaped in Penneys, Primark, they had a buying office in a place called Bracton in the UK. And the only department that was being bought for the Irish stores in Ireland at the time, when I joined them in the mid-80s, was menswear. But Mr. Ryan and the board felt that they could do with having a buying office in Ireland for all the departments. So they needed people to populate. And I remember Bridget Donahue interviewing me or asking me, would I come up to the buying office? And I remember being in her office saying, well, Mr. Donahue, are you asking me or are you telling me? So I went up into buying administration, and one of the buying team was out sick at one stage, and I was asked to step in. And I had an early job in Cork in an office, and it sold balance sheets and balances and beds and cots. So I kind of knew the difference between a balance sheet and a balance. So I ended up, and threw in the deep end in Penneys. I ended up buying homewares, and then I ended up buying footwear, and I ended up going to the Far East, going to Hong Kong, going to mainland China, going to Taipei, Taiwan. So I learned an awful lot and it was a very, very young business, and we were opening a lot of new stores. So at the time, for instance, the Irish business was 55% of the Penneys Primark business. Now Ireland's only 10%. So I learned an awful lot about buying, and then like that, they wanted somebody to manage the buyers with their financial stuff. And my numbers were quite good and quite numeric. So they asked me to be the merchandise controller. So as a result, I've been very lucky that I started in store operations, went into buying. And one of the reasons why they put me into that merchandise control job is that they felt I had store operation experience and buying experience. So I could relate to both of them. And a buyer is emotionally attached to a product. So my job was also to get the markdowns done, to get reductions of slow lines. And I had to be the buyer's conscience. I had to put them on the markdown list. And there used to be terrible debates going on. Dan, give it a bit longer and all this. But it's my job to clear the slow selling line, which was a success, and is still a success of Penneys Primark today. Get rid of the slow selling lines to make room for the new up and coming trends. Yeah. And as long as you keep your markdowns under control, you'll be a profitable business. So you're right. I've ended up being in, and that's why I got headhunted for that job in the UK with Littlewoods. They had a private label business and they had a branded business, and they found it very hard to get somebody with a private, high volume, low price background, and also understanding the DNA of brands and how to work with brands and how you have to really kowtow to them and, listen to all how great brand they are, while you're trying to get them into your business. And that's one thing I learned when I went to the Netherlands as well, with a lot of brands that we were trying to convince to come into our stores, but they were very slow because of the history of the buying curve. And you're trying to explain the Selfridges background. And by saying that I worked with Brown Thomas, quite a lot, their eyes would open up and say, oh, you worked for Brown Thomas. So it helped my background, and the stuff I've done, it certainly helped. And I really enjoyed it. And that's why I call myself a retailer. I've seen all sides of it.
Yeah, the luxury and obviously the cheaper. It's different. It's different.
For sure.
It's a different beast for definite, isn't it? And then looking at startups. So how when you're working with startups, Dan, you're used to working with big, large companies, big budgets, from a luxury and even from a high volume with the likes of Penneys. So how do you then translate that into these smaller startups? Does that make sense?
Well, I suppose look,
is it the same principles or is it very different? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. But the one thing I would say that I've learned from Penneys, Primark, Lifestyle Sports, Brown Thomas was retail is detail, attention to detail. Watch your costs. So when we used to have monthly profitability meetings with Brown Thomas, and if there was a cost line that was anywhere looking to be out of control, people were really get pushed to bring that back under control. So I apply the same discipline to these startups. Think about your customer first of all, and your sales. That's very important. But then watch your overheads. So for instance, when we opened a pop-up store in Dundrum with Peachy Lean, we were very careful about, well, what's the rent going to be? What's the rent and rates? What are the utility costs going to be? Let's do some sales projections. Let's see what we think we can do so that you don't lose money, that your lease is washing its face. And that's I suppose, the part that I would say that I brought from my experience, whether with Brown Thomas or Penneys Primark, is that you've got to scale yourself. You've got to cut your cloth to suit your measure. You've only got so much funding, and and some of those businesses, like for instance with Penneys, when I was the merchandise controller, you're only allowed to bring in so much stock every month. Same thing with Lifestyle Sports. So when you're dealing with lead times from getting product made, whether it's from China with Peachy Lean, or whether it's from the Lithuanian factory we use for Kokora Zenware, it's managing that cash flow about how much stock have you got, turning stock into sales. If you got some slow selling lines, maybe do a promotion and all that. So it's again watching that discipline so that you're not waking up some morning realizing that actually the cash flow is tight. I mean, cash flow is still king no matter what size business you're in. And when I was with Selfridges and with Primark and now with Peachy Lean and Kokora, we're watching their stock levels because stock ties up a lot of cash.
Yeah. And it can be difficult for startups with product-based businesses because they need to buy the stock first before they sell it a lot of the time, Dan.
For sure.
So it's that initial investment that they struggle with. So what kind of advice would you give? And I'm asking you this question because I do find that a lot of people would reach out to me and they'd go, they're struggling because they're trying to get money in the business initially to start it off. And I'm on about, Dan, companies that are, they've maybe starting a skincare range or something like that, you know what I mean, or an organic cleansing range or whatever that might be, and they're struggling to get that initial investment in their business. Is there any advice that you would give?
Yeah, I suppose my experience is first of all, make sure that those people are exploring all the opportunity you get with your, say, the Leo's, the local enterprise office, and with Enterprise Ireland, and making sure that you're getting every type of grant possible, every innovation voucher, whatever it may be. That you do see people using a phrase called bootstrapping. So how much of your own funds can you put in to get the business started? What family and friends can you approach? Now, you have to be very careful about approaching family and friends because you really want to take money from people who can afford to lose it. and not leave themselves hamstrung because you've got a great idea and money in there. And the only other thing I would say, which happened with me, I didn't know Wendy Slattery or Tracy Levin from Ireland, but they were tenacious in staying in touch with me. So you do need to use things like LinkedIn and business networks and people that you know to say, okay, I'm going to approach them there. So for instance, I was giving somebody advice lately who had a range of clothing to do with the horse riding area. And there's a lot of very wealthy people in that area, and there's a lot of great stud farms. So my approach to her was, look, you need to approach people in that network that you know will invest in your product. Now, at the same time, you need to be very, very clear about what your product does. So I always say for people who are raising money and investing and pitching for money, first of all, you're going to produce a lot of decks because you're tweaking a deck. And I was just before this call looking at some of the decks we had in the past, and I think definitely to double figures in Beauty Buddy, the decks you use. So you have to explain. So if you mentioned skincare, for instance, well, what problem is your skincare range solving? Mm-hmm. Okay, maybe somebody has a particular problem with their skin. Your product is going to solve that. So you've seen a problem, you've got a solution, and then how will you monetize that? So what is the size, let's say, of the skincare market, and what percentage of that are you going to take? Because if you're pitching for an investment, whatever about family and friends who know you, when you're in a room of strangers, they need to understand they are going to be very slow to part with their money unless they feel that you've got something that resonates with them. And if you lose, in my experience, and I've been on both sides of the table. So I've invested, I pitched for investment, and I've been on the other side where now I'm a member of the Saudis H band, where I've seen pitches. And if you lose your audience early on, that can be a struggle. And there's a lot of people, and I'm not being disingenuous to them, who have got great ideas about a skincare range or a children's wear range or a horse riding range or whatever it might be, and they think that this is unique to them. And it can be, as long as they have a story to tell around their brand. So for instance, there's a handbag brand out there that I gave some advice. They call it My Name is Ted. And they talk about the grandfather who lost a hand and how he did all his leather work and all that kind of stuff. Sharon Keegan tells a lovely story about how she created Peachy Lean based on some challenges she had personally when she went back after her first child. Sharon Farron tells a great story about Kokoro because she's very, very passionate about the environment and bamboo and all that stuff. So you'll win your audience over by having a unique story to tell and getting funds that way. But people are, and even now with the economy the way it is, utility bills and the war between Russia and Ukraine, there's less and less money, in my experience, being invested in startups at small scientists. It's difficult to raise money. And the success stories you see in the press and on TV and in the printed press about businesses that have raised funding and all that, there's lots of companies out there still trying to raise funds. So you need to have a unique story. You need to be able to tell it convincingly, and you need to be able to show to people that people will buy this product. And it can be a challenge, particularly if you're what's called pre-revenue, where you haven't even got any sales yet. That's one of the hardest parts to get funding for, as opposed to if you're already raising money. Like we raised some more money recently for Peachy Lean, because especially during COVID, and she was on Dragon's Den on the BBC, she got a lot of coverage there, and a lot of sales. So we just raised some more money, and we got some new investors because the product is already doing sales B2C, direct to consumer.
Brilliant. Yeah. No, I think it's really, really good advice what you gave there. And I think looking at the market share of that particular product assortment at the moment and seeing what percentage you're going after, I think that's really, really interesting. And I probably don't see that research being done properly enough with some startups. I think they're passionate about their product. They have a great story, but I think some of them are struggling with like the analytical side of it. Does that make sense, Dan? And the numbers a little bit.
It does. And I would also say, and I'd be an example, like entrepreneurs by the name entrepreneur have certain skill sets, and you do need like what I found with myself is that I've often said to people that I've working with and ones that I've invested in, put your advisors on your deck. So it also adds some weight to your deck. And you'll have people, if you have a mix of skill sets in your business, there'll be it's the boring stuff, it's the financial stuff, it's the projections. And it's all very fine talking about the product. But I always say to people, you should have two decks at any one time: an investment deck that has the story of your brand, but also all the financial projections, and then a brand deck that just tells the story about your brand. So in other words, if you're trying to get into a retailer with your brand, they're interested in the brand story. Then they won't be interested in your financial projections and all that kind of stuff, because they'll take that as a given. But if you're looking for investment, you have to tell your brand story at the beginning. You also have to tell why you're raising this money, or to use it for, and then also have your slide showing the people who are advising you, or who are who are in the business, and who've had background elsewhere. So, for instance, I think the old days it used to be the head of IT. Now I think they're called CTO. It's the Chief Technology Officer. If that CTO has a background with one or two other businesses, let's say, that had an exit and sold, that adds extra weight to your business. And what I found with me, that people have used me because of my background: Primark, Brown Thomas, Selfridges, Lifestyle Sports. It resonates quite a lot, particularly in Ireland and the UK, and maybe in mainland Europe. Maybe not so much. I remember we had a gig in New York with the Beauty Buddy gang, and this guy we got 30 minutes with pointed at me and he said, "You're nobody over here. You're nobody. Nobody knows you. You guys have to have all this traction and get all these reviews." So it's interesting to get that feedback. But I would say, to the entrepreneurs who are starting a brand, widen the skill set you need, so that you've got people covering your back from the point of view of the financials and the investment, and they can answer questions on your financial projections if you're pitching for investment.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. So people that are starting off, getting those people with those varied skill sets, Dan, even like nearly on a voluntary board, or even if, for whatever stage you're at in that process, at even an advisory level, to help you just to gain that traction, or to gain that strategy piece to grow the business.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we had an advisory board meeting the other day with Peachy Lean, and one of our board members now is Meg Lustman. And again, I'm not saying any that you can't find in the press. She's on the board of Ted Baker, for instance, and she's invested in the business recently. So she adds another dimension, because, on a previous podcast that you did, I heard you mention the word being blinkered. You can sometimes be blinkered about your own brand, and you're loving it and all that great stuff. And then, an extra set of eyes will say, "Well, have you thought about this, or have you thought about that?" So that's where I go, and I've learned a lot by even listening in to other advisors giving it, or to pitches where they're listening to other people challenging some of the criteria around the pitch, and you say, "Oh, that's an interesting point," So it is very useful, as long as you get the right people, and as long as it's what I always call constructive debate, not destructive.
Yeah.
And I would also say to people who are in the startup world and have an idea, there'll be a lot of people saying, "Oh, no, that'll never work." And there'll be a lot of people saying, "Oh, no, sure." If you take Peachy Lean as an example, I mean, she's doing $1 million a year. She's up against online out there with Sweaty Betty and Lululemon and Nike and Adidas and all those guys all have their own. So what's unique? And that's the other piece I would say. What's unique, and what values and what community do you have around your brand? That seems to be, in my experience, much more important than it was years ago, where people just bought something. Now there's a lot of people buying things because they like the story behind the brand. And that's also a key thing to getting advisors on board. I mean, Meg will say herself, one of the reasons why she put money into Peachy Lean is that she loved the story that Sharon told. And also she loves the fact that it's doing sales as well. So don't resist getting help from people that you feel can help your business.
Yeah, definitely. I suppose you've told a lot of stories about retail, and you've worked in loads of different markets, Dan. You've worked like all over with different size. What would be for you, with all your knowledge and experience, has there ever been any kind of key lessons where you have taken that learning? It could have been in the workplace where something has happened, good, bad, or indifferent, and that you felt it kind of shaped you to bring you on the journey that has taken you to where you are.
Yeah, I suppose it was interesting. I suppose the Dutch business, I say this to some college students that I talk to, working out into the world. The Dutch business was a very interesting business to join, because I have predominantly worked in Ireland and the UK, and obviously there's differences in culture between the UK and Ireland, but it was very interesting to go into the Netherlands, because previously that business had been owned by private equity, and then the Selfridges group bought it. And the Selfridges group is very much about premium department stores and brand relationships and all that kind of stuff. So what Paul Kelly did was he sent me over to the Netherlands, and it was a bit like that old joke, the Irishman, Englishman, and Scotsman walk into a bar, because it's a Scotsman and an Englishman and myself at one stage over there, and we were kind of known as the imports into the Netherlands by the local management, but didn't realize so much later on. And I found in the beginning there was, and every nationality has their own pride. I found in the beginning that they were very resistant to feedback, the Dutch management team, and found it difficult to resonate with them. And I also heard afterward that I was known apparently as Paul Spy, that I came over from Ireland and came into the Netherlands for 2 or 3 days a week, and then left again on the plane, and then next week back again. But over time, I managed to win their confidence over. And the key part for me was I decided to learn Dutch as an example. So I got a book initially, and I was reading this book, and it was very phonetic. That's right English to use, where I explained how to pronounce the word. But then I realized that there was also a CD that went with it. So I always say, it's a bit like anybody who knows that movie, Shirley Valentine, where she talks to a rock. I used to talk to myself in my apartment with the CD and the book. And then I insisted that the Dutch people held meetings in Dutch, and I could ask questions in Dutch. And they were very accommodating. And they love speaking English, the Dutch, because they get the practice of English. But it really, really got me on board with them. And I went to stores regularly. I got to understand the landscape. So in other words, if you go, I didn't just go to the Bijenkorf store in Rotterdam and The Hague or in Eindhoven. I would then spend time walking the high street. And if I spotted, let's say, Michael Kors is opening a new store, we'd feed that back to the buying team. They mightn't have been aware of that. Then on to Michael Kors, listen, guys, we promoted your handbag brand in our store. Now you're opening your own store. But also when we had regular meetings then with the team from the UK, the Selfridges team, it was so funny. I used to sit on one side of the table with Paul Kelly and the guys from the UK when they visited. And then one day, Giovanni, the CEO, rang me one night and he said, Dan, I want you to sit on the same side as us. You're one of us now. And we had a joke about it that morning, because they were saying, oh, there's been a transfer like in the football thing. Dan has now gone to the other side. But to me, it was a great endorsement. I felt that and when I left the Netherlands to help with the Arnott's Brown Thomas integration, when Mr. West bought the Arnott's, a lovely send off from the CEO, and he said, Dan, you were the only one that really spoke Dutch, and you're the only one that really got to understand our culture. And I would say to anybody that goes to work in other countries, get to understand their culture, be respectful. I mean, if I go back to my time with Penneys, Primark, even going to the likes of Hong Kong and mainland China, I was told beforehand, if you get handed a business card, make sure you study it and you hold it a certain way, look at it, look at the eyes of the person that gave it to you. And that's very, very important in the agent. So I would say, get to understand the culture. When I worked in Canada for Holt Renfrew, which is again part of the Selfridges group, there were some people there, nothing against people from New York, by the way, but there were some people there who were working in Holt Renfrew who were from New York. And I saw that the Canadians and and the North America, the guys from New York, didn't always gel together, and it was like a bit of this. Canada is quite different from North America, so it's understanding differences in culture. And again, I'm going to tell a little bit against myself now as an original Cork man. You know, sometimes you hear from people in Cork saying, "Ah, but Cork is different." So, you know, the Netherlands is different, France is different, Spain, you know, was different. When I worked for Primark in Spain, for instance, at one stage we sent product with the Spanish colors to every store that we'd opened in Spain, but there was some of them in what's called a Catalonia district, and they don't use the Spanish flag. So they were very unhappy that this product came in with the Spanish flag colors on it, because they felt that they, as far as they were concerned, they were Catalonian. So my advice would be, get to understand the culture of the country and the company that you're working with if you move outside Ireland.
That's really, really important, I think. And I think that's what you've just said there. That's not only a lesson in business, it's a lesson in life. I think it's taking the time to actually know and be curious and find out more and care enough to find out more, because many of us are, I don't have time, you know, and this blanket approach, because we're constantly, but I think it's you know, it's making that time to get to know, which I think is really interesting, because you can see then how you formed these great relationships with people. As you said, you didn't burn bridges, you kept those relationships there, you valued them, but you invested your time in them, because I can tell by somebody that's learning a language, going into a new country, that invests time, that's because that relationship is an investment in itself. Yeah.
And at the time that Dutch business was going through a real feeling of transition, they'd been owned by private equity, not really been asked very many questions, whereas Paul Kelly and the Selfridges people are very much into brand relationships. They were also in a bit of a catch-22. They were, I would describe them, without any disrespect to these brands now, Debenhams and House of Fraser, with some premium brands, particularly in Amsterdam, kind of caught in the middle ground. And what we were getting them to do was to be a more premium department store, and they were a bit resistant to that. And they had an event every year called the Three Crazy Days, 3 dagen blazen. And they were very slow to drop that, and it meant a lot of turnover and sales to their business, but it wrecked the stores. They were just a mess. There was just these 1,000 people coming in. So to get them to move on to a premium and explain how you don't have to have long summer sales or winter sales, people like new stock, people will buy premium brands. You know, it took a while, and by being able to say, well, look, I've gone through all this, because when I joined Brown Thomas, they were rebranding and changing a lot of their business time. You're too young to remember this, Louise, but there was a business called the Switzer Group that Brown Thomas had bought. So it was Moons of Galway.
Moons of Galway.
Moons of Galway. And he had Todd's in Limerick and Cash's in Cork. Yeah. So over time, those businesses went through a lot of change while I was with them under the stewardship of Paul. And so by bringing that sort of experience and showing these guys, and when results came about that meant these things worked. And there's some people bought into it over there too, to be fair, but they weren't all resistant. It really, now if you ever Google the buying core from the Netherlands, you'll see very, very positive stories about that business. We closed 5 what we call fashion modest stores, 5 small fashion stores. And again, what was interesting about that, again, how small the world is. 3 of those stores were sold to Primark. So I actually helped swap those stores over to Primark. And I remember we had to make sure that they were really nice, and the shell of the store was really, really perfect for when Primark would take it over. But I knew people in Primark, so I said to them, look, if there's any glitches, any problems towards the end, give me the heads up beforehand, rather than escalating it and there's a big row about it. So that was very helpful to have those kind of contacts in Primark. And I used to see them on the plane going back and forth, and it was kind of funny in a way to visit those stores to see the Primark. And I remember, again, just to give you an example about the importance of networking and being on the shop floor a lot. When Rotterdam opened, Primark and Rotterdam opened, it opened right opposite the Bijenkorf. So I decided to go there on the day that Primark opened. And when I got into the Bijenkorf, in the cafe was Mr. Weston and Paul Merchant and a couple of other senior execs from Primark who were taking a break from the store being open to just have a coffee and also have a look around the Bijenkorf and see what the Bijenkorf were up to. And Paul Kelly was delighted that I had met them and welcomed them to the Bank Wharf and wished them all the luck with their Primark store. So again, it's back to that piece I said earlier about, from my point of view, networking has been very important.
In business, yeah, I totally agree with that. I think it's getting out there, telling your story, like you said earlier.
Yeah.
Telling your story, and I think it's connecting. We connect. We're really good storytellers. The Irish, we're brilliant. We're known for it. So it's, it's telling that story, and I think it's connecting with someone. You connect through emotional stories. You build those bonds. So yeah, no, it's been really interesting. We're coming to the end, and I want to ask you one last question. What do you feel? Retail's gone through a lot of changes, as you know. There's a huge push with omni-channel. Through COVID, a lot of independent retailers and SMEs that weren't driving the online were pushed. They had loads of support through the government initiatives. Where is the future with online? Because obviously a lot of the bricks and mortar, I can see it here in Galway myself, Dan, a lot of the units, the commercial units in Galway city centre are vacant at the moment. And kind of talking around giving maybe, smaller, newer brands, pop-ups, looking at things like that, just to reignite the city centres and smaller places, because Galway isn't a Dublin, it never will be a Dublin, but just to bring people back in footfall into the city centre, not just eating in the restaurants and the pubs. But where do you see kind of retail going in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think, COVID taught us a lot. I think it accelerated where online shopping growth rate, certainly the percentage of sales that were being done online, certainly accelerated that. The other side of it was when stores reopened again, there is, in my experience, there's room for bricks and clicks. And I do think, and I listened to another podcast you did where this whole piece about, and I saw it in Amsterdam. I lived in Amsterdam for 5 years, where people could live above the shops. So, it's important that the city centres have a life and that stores aren't empty. And I was in Cork recently and I saw a lot of stores empty on Patrick Street. So I do think the government needs to maybe just, again, look at the incentives and what sort of rents and rates can you do to incentivize people to open stores. It can be a challenge to open a store and think about what rent and rates you've got to pay before you even start. And then also about the whole piece about public transport and getting people in. I do think there's always going to be a mix, I think, between online and stores. And I do know, for instance, one of the businesses I worked in the past, Lifestyle Sports, when I was with them, we just had a brochure or website in 2008 because we really couldn't afford to have a transactional website, and Lehman Brothers banking crash had happened. Now their online store is the number one store, except even though there's lots of business online, a lot of it is click and collect in the stores. And the important piece there is in the early days, and I still think it's a little bit out there again still today, there's a bit of a disconnect sometimes with the stores. They feel that the online is taking business away from them. And I really think it's up to the retailers to promote that it's what they see in the store resonates with what they've got online. And like, for instance, we're in the Dutch business is a good example. We used to give the stores, we cut the country into segments. So we used to credit the stores with online sales from their area, and that really got the buy-in. So I think there's two parts to your question. Number one is making sure that a retailer who has bricks, and Next is a great example. I would encourage people that you can get them on the web to read the Next when their public accounts come out. They talk very much about how the stores and their estate will shrink in size going forward, but never shrink away completely. And how, for instance, a lot of returns go through their brick stores, and how a lot of click and collect goes through their stores. And again, a good example of an Irish retailer I know who's gone into a whole click and collect now is Shaw's, and the guy called Gordon Newman doing a bit of work with them, who did a lot of work with Lifestyle Sports. So I think it's the omni-channel experience. You have to have that, and have a good online website that replicates what you're doing in the store. And I do think, whereas the local councils or the local government, they really need to make sure that we don't take the heart out of the high street and promote even if it's pop-up stores for busy times of the year, and maybe, you know, rent-free area, whatever it may be, just incentivize them to come into the city.
Yeah, and I think people still want. I hear a lot of people talk about it's. Yeah, I think people that aren't in the retail space say to me, "Oh, Louise, like, what are you doing retail training for? Sure, there's going to be no retail shops." I'm like, I do laugh to myself, because like there will always be a need. There will always be a need for retail stores. I can just see it. And I think the online is just an extension. It's just another touch point. So having an app with your brand is an extension. It's just, they're all customer touch points and they're interlinked.
Yeah.
It needs to be interlinked and as seamless as possible. So, I'm talking to you. Our shops don't close the shutters at 6 p.m. We're 24-hour business now, because we've our online store, we've our social media piece. If you have an app for your brand, that's another place where we speak to you. So I think what I see the big scope with retailers is, and you see kind of the bigger brands, Rituals Cosmetics do this really well, where they've created a community around their brand. Like, I just thought it was really, really interesting. So they have their app, you can buy their products, but they give you free healthy eating recipes. They give you mindfulness tools, they give you meditations, and they promote well-being as part of a byproduct of what you buy in the stores to create a spa experience at home.
Sure.
So I think it's about that. When I look at a brand, it's the brands that seemingly hold is the ones that create a community, because that community then brings you together.
Yeah. It's funny you should say that, because the Beauty Buddy, I mean, one reason why I was really interested in that as an app, because it's like TripAdvisor for beauty. You can scan the barcode in a beauty store and look at what it can do for you. And the girls at the time were trying to buy a makeup brush and they couldn't find which one suited them. But they've got a community now of independent reviews, and the community is so important to them. Community is so important to the PG Lean. I mean, there's a lot of stuff on social media with Instagram and TikTok and all that kind of stuff, and the same with Kokoro. And that's a part for me that's been a big learning curve too, is understanding, okay, you've got the online website, you've got the brick store, but you also need to be active in social media, talking about your brand, talking about its values, doing these little reels. My kids know more about this kind of stuff now than I do, but I love watching those things and seeing the likes and seeing if you do a shopping event at nighttime, that people resonate with the person that's doing that.
Yeah, and I think if you look at Una O'Hagan from Mars Pharmacy, she's a brand ambassador for that pharmacy group. And that's a really great way, I think, for businesses, retailers to look at the way she, she doesn't need to create.
I love her debates the way she talks about even hiring people. She talks about, we're looking for a new technician. But the way she talks about it is just, you want to go work for her.
The passion, you can feel it through the screen. I just think, and we had Una on the podcast and I interviewed Una, and what really stood out to me was, for a pharmacy chain, the way she was driving brand values, behavioral values in the organization, all of these key deliverables. And I've worked for companies where there's 800 stores, and she's way ahead of her game with that. And I just thought, that's what actually makes a brand last, is that real good culture, but that structure around what does that good culture look like, which I think is.
Anyway, it's interesting, we talk about big businesses. I was in New York recently, and I had a shopping list for a friend of mine. So I was in a Sephora store, and I need for a man to be in a beauty store, I know, but I'm fine with all of that with my background. And the first thing, when I asked for this brand, the first thing the sales assistant said to me was, "We don't carry the full line here." So she was already on a negative, like as if to say, well, if you're looking for this particular item, instead of saying, we carry some of the range and the rest will be online, or we can order it for you, because you didn't know whether I was a visitor or not. But the opening line, and then I'm saying to myself, this Sephora will probably have all these corporate ideals and values and training, and here is someone in the front, and I'm passionate about customer service. I could do it on front line, so important. Service. She lost me at that comment. Now she still showed me where it was, and then left me, and then their program at the till to say to you, "Did anybody help you today?" And I felt like saying, "No." It's
so interesting, Dan, isn't it? But it's so interesting, because I speak to people and, you know, managing directors and you know, HR departments, L&D, and the thing is, you can have the best brands, right? You can have the best marketing department, best buyers in the world, but the customer will only understand the personality of your brand by that person speaking to them on the shop floor, because they are the brand. Do you know what I mean?
That's one thing I really learned that in Brown
important.
Thomas in the early days. Like we had a guy who was selling a million a year, and Tony was his name. Someone up to Tony one day and I said to him, Tony, what's your secret, you know? And he said, I'd always read the newspaper in the morning, see what the headlines is for the day. And then when the person would come in, I'd start chatting about that. And he lived and breathed
Icebreakers.
values.
It's like those great icebreakers, Dan. You know, when you're training people in, and some people it's harder to stroke up the conversation. We go, what are you going to talk about today to the customer? So it's really interesting. He invested in those opening conversations to make it interesting for the customer. So
and he was great then, you know, when someone looked at his suit, he'd always say, that shirt will go great with it. He had a very subtle way of the add-ons, you know.
It was conversational selling, almost story selling. Amazing. It's been really great to talk to you today. We've talked about.
Me too, Louise. Really enjoyed it. Thanks for the invitation. You're very good. It's great.
Thanks a million. Thanks for coming on. Dan, where can everyone find you? LinkedIn, I'm assuming.
LinkedIn is the best way to get me. And that's probably the best way.
The best way. So
I don't have, as I said, I don't have a website for the DR retail side.
But
I don't think most people have found me through. Most people have found me through LinkedIn, and it's, to my mind, it's been a great.
It's fantastic.
To use. I often say to people, look, it's the sort of the Facebook of business. When I hear people saying they're not on LinkedIn, I said, look, you should. Especially in the early part of your career, or if people are searching for contacts, so reach out, send an invite. What harm can it do? And then engage with the person.
The worst thing you can get is a no, isn't it? Move on.
Exactly.
That's it. Thank you so much, Dan. If you want to reach out,
Louise, it's been great.
Thanks a million. Check him out on LinkedIn.